Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's Skill-Share session. We are still waiting for a few people just to filter in from the waiting area. So we'll give them a few moments or so. Also, just to give me some time to sort out my platform and see what's going on and understand that I'm getting everything right and I'm recording and doing all the things that I've forgotten in the past. So that's... All right, perfect. Yeah. So as I said, it's gone on 2:00. So I suggest we kick off, and those who are still filtering in can join us. Just in terms of introductions, everybody, I hope on the call knows who I am. I am the Executive Director of the South African Engineers and Founders Association. So again, welcome to this afternoon session. This afternoon session, as always, is going to be hosted by Brad Wattridge, who's a communication strategist, vast experience over 27 years, probably close to 30 years now by I'm sure. And is a published co-author and thought leader on LinkedIn. He specializes business growth through impactful strategies. And joining him today is Chris Hutting, who everybody, of course, knows from the weekly risk alerts that we send out to our members. And Chris, of course, is the Executive Director at the Center for Risk Analysis. And that's what I would say is by far the leading South African think tank, which understands what drives the country's political economy within the context of the broader international strategic environment. So welcome, Chris, welcome, Brad, to this afternoon session. And can I hand over to you, Brad, to take us away with the show, please?
Yeah, thank you so much, Gordon. Does 30 years mean I'm old?
Not at all. Just vast experience.
You know, somebody said to me, because I've got my photo on my email signature, and somebody said to me, why have you got your younger brother on your email signature? I was so insulted. I'm like, guys, 2025 has been a heavy year. I don't know about anyone in the room, but for me, it feels like it's been such a disruptive year for us. But yeah, I've got Chris with me. And I must say, when I read through, Chris's slides and then I did a bit of research and everything, this is going to be such an interesting topic. And I'm glad it's going to be discussionable because we've got people in the room that I know are going to pop down messages in the chat section and going to engage with us, Chris. And we every now and again are going to stop you and ask you some questions. But today we're going to be talking around the future of our economy. And, are we in a reform or decline? And I think naturally a lot of us are going to go decline without even, like using your card on payday, just decline. But I think for me, it's important for us to look at the facts. And that's exactly what you do. Hey, Chris, just take us through your process of prep, brother.
Yeah, we definitely try and do that as far as possible because all of us as, so-called professional analysts or just, people interested in the politics and the economics, we all have filters and biases in all the things we try and think about the world. So our starting point is collecting data on South Africa and on the country and from as reputable sources as possible. And then we check the data sort of against each other. So there's no point in me telling you GDP growth was 0.8% in the second quarter. We try and link data points to each other. And then secondly, connecting what you would see on the front pages of a newspaper in terms of the headlines to the political section, to the economic section, to other sections, because these things are interlinked and impact on each other. That's how we try and understand the world. So it's not just a case of us throwing spreadsheets at you. It's about making sense of how do businesses deal with the current environment.
Wow, Chris, that sounds absolutely amazing. So what are you going to take us through specifically? I know you've got kind of a briefing outline. What are you thinking?
Yeah, so today we're going to look at a few key items in the sort of South African economic story. We're going to first start off setting the context. What is the economy looking like at this point in time? I just want to, sort of situate us in 2025. Where are things at this moment? Because there is so much going on domestically and internationally. Every day there are more headlines, not to throw even more at us, but today is supposed to be the deadline of the end of AGOA. So then we filter that in as well. So we're going to look at a few of our domestic economic indicators. We're going to look at questions around the Reserve Bank and monetary policy, where there's been a debate and discussion around, can't the Reserve Bank the mandate of the Reserve Bank be changed? Just attain economic growth. Why can't we change that mandate to get us 3% or 5% growth? I'll look at some of the arguments for and against that. And then we'll look at South Africa's industrialization question, where, I mean, we've often got the importance of the manufacturing sector, the construction sector, steel. These things are talked about daily. Politicians, business people, you know, talk about how important it is for South Africa. We'll look at that question with a focus on Newcastle and of course, what's happened there in terms of AMSA, in terms of local steel manufacturing, demand for steel, what that tells us about, number one, manufacturing, but number two, if we want to reindustrialize South Africa, what are some of the policy ideas that could be put forward in that regard?
So, Chris, do you think we are UK in the 80s, losing our industrialization edge under Thatcher?
I think that's a very good analogy and a very good way to try and understand it, because if you compare how much our manufacturing sector contributed to GDP even 15 and 10 years ago, that has declined quite a bit up until now in 2025. And given that it's also a very labor-intensive sector, if you link it to our unemployment rate, those kinds of sectors like manufacturing and construction, they should be your labor absorption sectors ordinarily. Now, we should highlight some of the international factors here that have influenced global steel demand. You've had massive output from China, for example, quote unquote, flooding other markets like South Africa's. But then you couple that with our domestic sort of weaknesses, like electricity supply, the ports, that kind of thing. I think it's a good analogy that you raise, and it does help us to understand maybe, even if we assume best case scenario, we can reinvigorate our domestic steel industry to that kind of level it was, 10 or 15 years ago. We also need to think about a different world in that regard as to where the UK was. So if you look at globally, competition, skills, which sectors can absorb more labor. We've got many young South Africans who are looking for work. I don't think we should put all of our eggs in that sort of basket and say, look, the UK could manage this in a certain way. How do we do it? I think we have to factor in some domestic South African unique aspects as well.
Fantastic, Chris. Do you want to take us through it? You ready to rock and roll?
Thank you. Thank you, Brad. I really appreciate the sort of springboard for us to get going. I feel like I'm in a backline being managed by Sasha, and you're the fly half. So now I just get to run with the ball and take us through what we're going to talk about today. So yeah, Brad, thank you again. Gordon, everyone else who's helped to organize, we really appreciate the opportunity to take you through some of the latest analysis and data from the Centre for Risk Analysis. We're going to look at the future of South Africa's economy and questions around reform or decline. Just to break it down again in the sections, so we're looking at the mandate, we're looking at restoring investor confidence, and we'll come to reindustrialization, some of the lessons from Newcastle. Before I get into the data, those specific sections, I want to share some overview data firstly, just to situate where South Africa finds itself. So here we present GDP growth for different countries, different regions, including India, China, emerging markets, upper middle income countries, and the world, and then of course South Africa. Your different bars represent different years. So we've got red is 2023, orange is 2024, and your gray bar is your year to date for 2025. And then these little black lines indicate the long-term average. So you can look at South Africa and how much we've been lagging behind other regions in the world. Now, I know we can't compare countries exactly one-to-one. Different developing countries have different strengths and weaknesses. Different developed markets have different strengths and weaknesses. But we just want to find out where we are at this point in time. So you look at our long-term average over the last 21 years at around 2.2%. So it's South Africa's normal at this point in time is between 1% and 2% growth. Other emerging markets, and especially our BRICS peers, and we know that we love to talk about BRICS and the potential of BRICS, and South Africa is a valued partner, but some of our BRICS allies, they do perform better economically, especially India and China. India being couched very much as the next growth engine for the world, even more so than China. China's economy encountering quite a few domestic struggles at this point in time, not least of which, of course, their property markets, but also their pension funds and pension savings, are encountering pressure. And now in 2025, of course, the pressure from the United States in the form of very high tariffs. So that's going to put even more of a dampener on Chinese growth. So we just want to highlight here for South Africa, a lot of this is coming before 2025. This is coming before Trump 2.0, before the reciprocal tariffs. A lot of this is driven by South Africa's domestic policy choices. When we look at things around property rights, when we look at labor markets, when we look at questions around policies that encourage or discourage investment, those kinds of things are a long time coming. When one raises doubts about some of these things, not even if you implement it in the worst case scenario, but if you raise doubts about capital formation, about people building new businesses in a country, about deploying their capital, you start to raise questions for those domestic and international investors about whether they should really invest in that particular country. And of course, that then affects your overall growth rate. I don't want to discount the impact of things like the global financial crisis, COVID-19 and the lockdowns. All of that, of course, would have impacted negatively on South Africa's domestic growth potential. But we haven't taken care of some of those domestic basics. And again, when I go back to basics, I talk about things like functional ports and railways. You look at electricity, reliable and relatively affordable electricity supply. You look at water supply and the management of wastewater. And then, unfortunately, you look at crime as well, and your police services, your private security services. How effective is the government at a national, provincial, metro level at dealing with crime, whatever form that might be, hijackings, murders, house robberies, all that kind of very basic. I know it's, in some ways, it should be basic and boring stuff, but we haven't necessarily always taken care of that. And when we don't, that then exposes us to some of these global headwinds when things become more difficult globally, as it is now in 2025, where South Africa, at the time of us having this discussion, South Africa faces a 30% reciprocal tariff from the United States. Today, the 30th of September, is the deadline for the extension of AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. It's unlikely that it will be renewed. But because we haven't taken care of some of these domestic levers, we're in a relatively weaker position now as things globally are more volatile and more uncertain. All of this is to say, despite not taking care of some of those domestic levers, despite the relatively weaker position in which we are, we have still achieved around an average of 2% growth between the year 2000 and 2024. So not as high as our emerging market peers, but not as low as one might have expected. That indicates to us, and I know it can become frustrating to say and to talk about, but that indicates to us that kind of resilience among South African businesses and South Africa's upside potential if we can get some of these basics in policy and service delivery right. Maybe not across the whole country, maybe in certain provinces or parts of the country, having to get it right in Gauteng, which is our most important economic province. That indicates to us that kind of potential in South Africa if some of these levers can be moved in the right direction. Just a very last note on this particular slide. I've been very lucky this year to travel quite a bit internationally. I've been to Washington twice. Great. I've been to Europe, and I've also been to Argentina. I just got back from Argentina last week. A lot of questions from international businesses and people keen to invest on South Africa are around when would the government of national unity get some of these very basic levers right, because they're very keen to deploy their capital in South Africa. There's this positive sentiment towards South Africa, but there's a question around, when is it right for them to really deploy their capital? When will things, from a domestic business environment and a pro-business environment, when will that change? So it's very much South Africa's front of mind for a lot of sort of investment funds, a lot of hedge funds, that kind of thing. But there's still doubts from those avenues about when they really invest in South Africa.
And what's your answer, Chris, when they ask?
So I highlight some of the progress in some of our state-owned entities like Eskom. Just today, if anyone didn't see, for the first time in 8 years, Eskom has reported a profit. And that is not on the back of just massively spending on the gas, on the open cycle gas turbines and burning diesel. It's getting the coal fleet functional again. So I talk about things like Eskom. I talk about the rhetorical reform at places like Transnet. And then I also talk about the competition of the government of national unity, where it's by no means perfect. We've unfortunately all been subjected to it since the elections last year. We saw it in the budget, the various versions of the budget this year. But for the first time in our national government, since democracy started in South Africa, we have actual competition in our politics, and that incentivizes better behavior, more innovation. It possibly helps oversight between departments and between ministers. Again, it's not perfect, but it could possibly spur the kind of reform we need. So we indicate to international audiences and investors to sort of hedge on South Africa. We think to come in now, and one would see the benefits thereof between the next 3 to 5 years. Given the low base of growth that we came from, if some of these reforms now really stick, and if we see it incentivized more on the sort of crime and corruption side, we think it's easy to see South Africa getting between 3% and 5% growth within the next 3 to 5 years.
What are we going to need in terms of growth numbers, Chris, in your opinion, to kind of reset our trajectory? Is it that 3 to 5? Is it a good bandwidth to talk about, or do you feel that it should actually be a little bit higher if we look at the comparison to the other emerging markets out there?
Yeah, I think it has to be about consistency. So if we can get, given that we've in the last 2 to 3 years been around 1% if we're lucky, if we can get between 1.5 and 2.5% consistently, so let's say for 3 or 4 quarters consecutively, that would indicate that there is more reason on the supply side, so those policy reforms and the ports and electricity and logistics, and also that there is more confidence in the economy, so amongst households and consumers to really spend in the economy, to consume in various different ways. Though that sort of indication, I think, would then feed into a higher growth rate of between 3 and 5% in the next 3 to 5 years, then you really get very bullish on South Africa.
Okay, fantastic, Chris. Trader policy uncertainty?
Yeah, just to sort of reinforce the global environment, if you think things are uncertain in South Africa, don't worry that we're such a massive outlier. Given what is happening in the world at the moment from the US in terms of trade policy, you can see on the right-hand side how much uncertainty around trade policy has spiked this year so far. So this is research compiled from a few different original sources put together in one particular index, which measures trade policy based on how frequently those related terms appear in major newspaper articles each month. So this is worldwide. So at the moment, the whole world is trying to deal with this new reality of high US tariffs, of uncertainty, where at some point tariffs can change at a moment's notice. And it's not just South Africa that is subjected to high tariffs. We've got 50% on Brazil. You've got 50% on India. Of course, we've got a high tariff rate on China. You look at how the US uses the threat of high tariffs to negotiate other issues with their trading partners. So keep in mind, the global environment is like this at the moment, which again reinforces, if South Africa can get some of these basics right, and if we can start to change some of the narrative, there's every reason to believe that more investment will flow into South Africa. Investors worldwide are continually looking for new opportunities. There's more questions than ever before about the US dollar, about the independence of the US Federal Reserve. In this environment of high volatility, it's up to those countries and those governments like South Africa's to get some of these signals right that we send to the rest of the world.
And sometimes we do also, we forget how long some of these international companies have been part of the South African fabric, and they've seen benefit in that. So I think it's not something that we have to prove for a new market. I think what we need to do is convince an existing investment market globally that we're actually still on the map. And yes, we do have these issues that we're facing, but this is a great time to come in, because now we're starting to see the turnarounds. We're starting to see the ports slowly improving, if I may say, Chris. And, Eskom showing a small little profit, albeit none of us really trust the facts and figures coming out of government, but albeit it's a good story.
Yeah, it is very much so. And a lot of growth and investment is also sentiment based. It's not necessarily only, on the data or the numbers that one would want to back your emotions or your sentiment with the right kind of data. But if some of that narrative can change, I think it does indicate something going forward. And again, South Africa's developed links with the rest of the continent, the strength of our financial sector. These things are not to be taken for granted. The independence of our Reserve Bank. Not many other countries can say they have those things. So it's again about leaning into those strengths, I think.
Chris, I've got a question, and I hope it's not far segued off what we're talking about, but I often think to myself, a lot of our political parties, a lot of our government ministers or in the ministerial part of the government do a lot of fact-finding internationally. They travel to foreign countries, and I'm not sure if they just look at how the countries are running or they talk to decision makers there about how they've solved their problems. One of my big questions is that South Africa is so unique. Should we not rather take a trip to Paris rather than Paris to just go and see how to fix water issues? I mean, is it that scientific? Is it that, is it that so difficult to solve that problem of supplying water to a community that you want to go on a R1 million trip to Paris to try and see how to solve it? I always wonder about that, Chris. What is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it shouldn't be. It's not that kind of thing that should be that difficult. Perhaps part of what we see in South Africa and some of the desire to go elsewhere on the part of policymakers to see what works is there's an unwillingness to acknowledge some of the domestic drivers of why these things don't work. And the biggest at this point in time is the issue of patronage and sort of vested interests. So for what still is South Africa's biggest political party, the ANC, so much of its influence has been built up through patronage networks. It's going to be very difficult to break those up. And when they're in place, you're incentivized to then, see waste and corruption. And if there's a new tender to fix water treatment facilities in Paris, it's rather given to those with the necessary political connections versus the company or the individuals who can do it most cost effectively and also in the shortest amount of time to make sure that the solution, is implemented and then lasts. So it's also, I think, that kind of ideological and emotional barrier, which over time I think is slowly but surely breaking down. We yesterday, unfortunately, again had confirmation from the SIU of around 2 billion rand worth of corruption that has now taken place at Tembisa Hospital. All of this first sort of indicated by Babita Deokaran, who was of course murdered, a whistleblower at Tembisa Hospital. But a lot of the reporting and the discussion we're seeing on social media and with people that we talk to is there's this over time increased realization that these things don't happen in isolation. It's about the policies and ideas that we implement that incentivize this kind of behavior. But because those things touch so closely on those very powerful vested networks of patronage between politics and the sort of criminal world, that kind of thing, that comes with serious risks if one is going to tackle that sort of thing head on.
I often feel that there's a lot of corruption globally. I just think they know how to do it better, still deliver what they need to deliver to their citizens and still take what they need to take. And I just don't think we've learned that art really well here.
Well, maybe we should have had clearer carve-outs for benefits.
Fair enough. But to shift back to trade policy uncertainty, so we're not alone. I think it's very important to realize that this has been an incredibly difficult year, globally and locally. I think it's the perfect storm, eh, Chris?
Yeah, no, it is. It does all come to a head. One should have. Yeah, in terms of the US specifically, and President Trump, he implemented a few of these ideas in his first administration. A lot of people would say, don't take him, whatever he might profess around trade policy or whatever, he's not that serious. I think a lot of people make the mistake with President Trump. They take him literally, but not seriously. And the point here is some of the executive orders, other implementations by his cabinet members, they might be implemented in different kinds of ways, but the ideas have been there for a very long time. So we knew that the US was going to enter this more transactional period of its trading investments. It's now about how countries deal with it in a more creative way. And we saw a little bit on South Africa's part of the sort of creative diplomacy. So when President Ramaphosa visited the White House earlier this year, and his delegation contained, ministers and labor and also a few sports people, it was a very South African thing and a kind of, creative way to deal with this new administration. But again, we haven't seen it sort of carried through. So I think there were elements of knowing this is what's coming. We need to think differently, but we haven't seen it consistently applied.
Yeah. So Chris, what is just, we're halfway through the session already. I told you it's going to go very quickly, but Chris, where does our opportunity, power, and strength lie as members of SAEFA? We're not sitting in the White House. We have a business in Brakpan. We get all these stats and this information daily from 702 or from yourself or wherever we get this information from. Where does our power lie? Where do we have control over? Because I think a lot of us feel so frustrated that we have no control of what's happening around us. We run great businesses, but the world is falling apart around us. What is your advice to us? Just a bit of a breaker between, I know you want to talk about the Reserve Bank mandate, and we can get into that now, but what's your take on that, brother? What advice have you got for us?
Yeah, it unfortunately has to be sort of a multifaceted approach. So it's that I want to link this maybe to what I mentioned earlier around some of the feedback I've gotten internationally about South Africa, but also the challenges that companies are facing in other places around the world. So specifically in the US and in Europe, many businesses, their capex is massive. They're listed on different stock exchanges, all that sort of stuff. But they haven't had to deal with governments that don't provide basic services in many instances, like South African companies have been forced to do for the last 15, 20 years in some cases, unfortunately. That kind of muscle memory, that kind of practice, that daily work to manage the higher risks, but then also to be ready to take advantage of the opportunities, that sort of thing just happens over time and with experience. And very many big companies around the world don't have that companies in South Africa have. So taking that kind of, I want to say it's a blessing. I know one shouldn't have been forced into this position, but taking those elements and those learnings and making sure that one's business can continue to operate and mitigating the risks. And number two, getting involved, whether it be directly or indirectly, in the political discussion and the policy framing discussion. So be it supporting, think tanks that one might agree with, be it engaging with local councillors in your metro, in your province, so that it then filters to national level, because the politics is not going to go away. I think it's probably going to become more competitive in South Africa. But that again means if we can get the right kinds of pressure out there, the right kind of ideas, you see the broad policy environment then also shifting. But again, you can't put all of your eggs in that basket. So I think because it's so competitive, and because South Africans are more and more frustrated with the status quo, the political and economic status quo, those businesses that show that they've operated in South Africa, they're doing things for the right reasons, they're invested in their communities and in their employees, I think they're going to benefit a lot over the long term. It just depends on the sort of risk that you're willing to deal with in the short term, because with high risk, more often than not comes more opportunity.
Yeah, and I think, Chris, if you look at like Holland, for example, your dad was a baker, your granddad was a baker, and a lot of us are first-time business owners. A lot of us are venturing in. So there's a lot of newity around, I guess, as well, that it kind of adds to that stress levels. But I think it's quite nice what you're saying, Chris, and it kind of makes me feel all warm and fuzzy around the fact that it does make us incredibly resilient. And I think that's one thing we underestimate as South Africans. Even if you're in another country, you can see us a mile away.
Yeah.
We just, and I want to swear, but I'm not allowed to, but we just push forward,
Yeah.
We just push forward. And I think it's very important to understand that things will change, but we are so used to change right now and so used to doing majority of the basics on our own that is actually giving us that competitive edge and resilience against the rest of the world.
Yeah,
So thanks for that,
absolutely.
Chris. I hope there wasn't too much of a sidetrack, but do you want to
No,
take
no.
us through the Reserve Bank's mandate and kind of structural reform? What are you thinking there, Boetie?
All right, that sounds good. Let's talk about this sort of hot button political issue that will likely come up again. I mean, next year we've got local government elections. In 2027, we've got the next ANC elective conference. Talks about the mandate of the Reserve Bank. These are formed part and parcel of many internal ANC discussions and will do so for other parties. It depends on how those parties perform, and specifically the 𝐂𝐡𝐫𝐢𝐬 party, which is the third biggest party in our politics. A lot of this is going to depend on how they perform. But broadly, the idea is around the South African Reserve Bank having a mandate to deal with inflation, to target inflation. Some other arguments against this is that one needs to expand the mandate to also target growth and employment. And broadly, the idea is that you, for example, artificially, or at least not backed by the data, but you try and force interest rates lower because then borrowing costs are lower, debt burdens are lower, both for the government and for private businesses. The risk, of course, is if you force down lower interest rates and inflation doesn't come down, you're really going to get into the kind of situation where those two become de-linked from each other, and then you don't have an independent Reserve Bank focused on just targeting money supply and inflation. Then you start to encounter that situation where international investors, international markets ask the question about your particular central bank and whether it is fit for purpose or not. So that's broadly the idea around changing the mandate. Some of the benefits of lower interest rates I did mention. But at the moment we've seen a few rate cuts, and those are on the back of already lower consumer price, the lower consumer price index, and lower prices in at least some sectors. There's still some that are quite sticky. If we look at elements like meat prices, some of our basic staples, those continue to be quite stubborn. But we see overall inflation in South Africa trending downwards. And then if your Reserve Bank cuts interest rates on the back of that, that's when you see real lower inflation. It's not sort of artificial lower inflation. Something that I would highlight to those advocating for changing the mandate of the Reserve Bank, you can do that. Cut the interest rate to 0.2%. That sort of thing does not fix the supply side drivers of inflation or the supply side issues in terms of growth and employment. So again here, I highlight the ports, the railways, electricity supply, labor markets, administered prices. Your administered prices are those prices or tariffs that are set by government. So water prices, for example, or NERSA setting electricity prices in consultation with Eskom. You can change the mandate of the Reserve Bank to your heart's content. It doesn't fix the supply side issues in the economy and possibly distracts, I think, from dealing with those more difficult political issues. We're seeing a bit sort of the possibility of politics becoming yet more involved in economics. And again, that raises questions around the independence of the Reserve Bank, and it is a risk to flag. So broadly, those are the points around the mandate. I think it's a nice topic sometimes for certain political parties to drum up, but it doesn't fix like some of our more fundamental issues in the economy. Brad, maybe if you wanted to highlight anything there.
Yeah, I'm a little quiet on this because I don't know too much, but I think for me, the independence of the Reserve Bank is something that we are globally recognized for. And I think if we look, as soon as there's some sort of a shift in government where they're trying to push forced economic growth, they will attack the reserve banks in their countries to try and get them to lower it as much as they can. So it's just a typical thing globally that politicians will attack an institute which they find is in their way. Politicians are all for immediate. They want change in their term. They've got 4 years. I mean, what's 4 years really if you think about how long it's going to take to turn some stuff around? So yeah, I think this is really interesting. Chris, what else do you want to lead on to here, Buti?
Yeah, so we'll lean into restoring investor confidence. As you rightly highlighted, having an independent central bank is so crucial for the sentiment and the narrative around a country. So if we talk about the broad issue of restoring investor confidence in South Africa, I've on previous slides and on previous points, I've talked about some of the lessons we've learned in our international engagements this year, how there's very positive sentiment towards South Africa. But again, a focus on having to get some of the basics right. When I talk about the bottom of the pyramid, if you can visualize, pyramid at the very base of that pyramid in terms of policy making in a given country, you've got your very basic issues of electricity supply, water supply, crime, dealing with crime, and probably corruption. The higher up the pyramid you move, the more you can have your sort of indulgent policy ideas. So you can have localization, you can have different kinds of master plans, you can have increasing different kinds of social welfare for those individuals in society who can't afford to work, for example. If you don't get the base of the pyramid right, then the rest of the structure is going to be inherently weaker and going to be more exposed. So again, it's boring work, but here's the opportunity for our policymakers, for our government, our elected representatives, from national to provincial to metro level, to focus on just getting some of those basics right in day-to-day governance. I'll lean into the last section on South Africa's industrialization, question some of the lessons from Newcastle. So I'm going to start just talking about the impact of policy. And here again, as I mentioned on the growth point, and South Africa having this relatively lower growth rate for the last 20 years, we're seeing what's happened in Newcastle, and specifically for ArcelorMittal this year. We've seen the long-term effects of some of our domestic policy choices, where, for example, you see the impact of lower construction demand, lower steel demand, lower growth more broadly. You can provide subsidies to ArcelorMittal, you can provide other forms of stimulus, but if there isn't that growth, that dynamism in your domestic economy to demand steel and steel products, those subsidies aren't going to help a company like ArcelorMittal forever. It might sort of stop some of the short-term
Kind of prop them up,
but it's not going to help forever. Exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe the points around what kind of industrial policy can South Africa afford. So again, maybe if we can get some of those issues right around what is holding back the manufacturing sector, what is holding back the construction sector, then we can indulge in more in-depth industrial policy, versus I think at the moment where the desire is to do it very top-down, to say that government is going to give certain targets in certain sectors and to certain companies, and that will just fix the overall structural issues. Boosting local demand, I think, is probably the easiest low-hanging fruit, and that again comes as part of a rising sentiment and a rising element of many companies feeling now is the right time to deploy our capital, let's build, and we're going to need that supply. I should mention that last bullet point. So I don't want to discount the impact of international competition, especially from a country like China, India, and elsewhere. We've seen the impact on the UK's domestic steel industry over many decades now. But the impact of imported goods in South Africa, I think, is something to keep in mind. And here is an element of where do policymakers step in to increase tariffs on imports? So if one is concerned about a specific product or a specific sector, and you talk about imports from other countries, which could increase, again, given the US tariffs at the moment, those tariffs could indeed incentivize Chinese companies and the Chinese government to export more to South Africa. Then you want your government, in the form of the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition specifically, to be more proactive in things like higher tariffs. Now, that doesn't mean it's a solution for the long term. Maybe you have a sort of sunset clause or a short-term timeline and see if it's the right kind of impact. But we also want government to then be proactive in that regard, where it's not just waiting to see what the impact is of those sort of cheaper imports over time.
So Chris, just going back to industrial policy that South Africa can afford. I think for a lot of us in the association, because we're on the ground and we're working within this, within a specific industry, we kind of have the answers. We know what will work and won't work. Why is government not consulting with us guys on the ground to get kind of what works? Because again, you don't need to go to Moscow to figure that out. You just need to go to L Road in the East Rand and just go and speak to some of those factories there and say to them, listen, what works, what doesn't. And I think none of us are against employing. If we have an opportunity, we want to employ. It's actually an ego thing to say, I employ a certain amount of people. It gives me positioning in my industry. It gives me positioning in the space that I occupy. So why is this massive disconnect between what's happening at government level and at JSE top listed companies and us on the bottom?
Yeah, I think it's a few things. So number one is probably the protecting of vested interests, and who's in the room, who gets to have that discussion. So you scratch my back, I scratch yours, and often it's not to the benefit of the country as a whole, but it's to the benefit of those in the room. You also look at some ideological considerations. I don't think it's as big an issue as it used to be 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, but there's still vestiges of this idea that you need the state to centrally manage the economy and society, and it will sort of invite comment from business when it feels it's appropriate, but otherwise it's not going to be, it doesn't see business and industry as a sort of equal partner. It thinks it should take the lead, and then others should follow if they're lucky enough to do so. And then it could also come down to sort of psychology and emotional aspects where you're in that position of government and you think you've got the answers, but you don't sort of get out of that bubble, and you can't really entertain the possibility that you might be wrong. That sort of the fallacy, the sunk capital or lost capital fallacy, that you've gone in there for however many years. How could you now acknowledge that you might be wrong? So it's going to take different avenues to break into that sort of world. You're seeing already vestiges of that. I mean, 2 weeks ago, when President Ramaphosa and his leadership addressed over 4,000 ANC councillors at a gathering in Gauteng, President Ramaphosa, he said, I'm not comfortable saying this, but we should ask the question about those municipalities where there is better service delivery. Which political party is in charge of that? So you're hearing in rhetoric, I'm not saying that they will follow on it, but you're hearing in rhetoric, asking questions of why things aren't working and what could be an alternative. So there's a point here on sort of strategy in terms of engaging with government. I think there has to be an element of sort of hard-nosed pragmatism and holding one's line as business and as industry. But number two is also providing new ideas or different kind of off-ramps for government, be it national, provincial, or local government, in terms of how can they in some ways still save face while looking like they're fulfilling their mandate of service delivery and building a sort of pro-business, pro-industry kind of environment.
Yeah, I think it's all hands on deck, and I think we're going to start seeing a massive shift, Chris. I don't know if you agree to private business being involved in government response and executing government responsibilities. I think the idea of old school government controlling everything is dying, and I think it's dying globally.
Yeah.
And we can just see the sentiment on the ground. I think there's a massive disconnect between, when I say us, the guys on the ground, and the corporates sitting in the towers with the business. And I don't want to sound like a revolutionist, but I do think there's a global disconnect. I don't think it's just us. I think you can speak to anyone from any country and they will tell you that government and the big corporates are not including us in conversations. And we need to be included because we know what's going on the ground. So I think it's really important. SAEFA is a great place to be because we are represented. We do have a bit of a voice. We've got Gordon and Charlene and the team and everybody sitting in this room that, kind of stands up and comes together collectively. And you mentioned it earlier, Chris, about being part of your community. Stop just kind of ostriching your head in the ground. We can't do that anymore.
No, I couldn't endorse that message more. If I could give my stamp of approval on the screen, I would. So.
Oh, that's cool, Chris. But so Chris, we've got 15 minutes left. Not much questions, but I'm never worried about that because the audience numbers stay, which means the guys are staying around, they're listening in. And I know that they appreciate what we are talking through because I find, the information is very useful and we've circled it back to us sitting here in the room. But again, Chris, before you move on to the other slides, just bringing it back to the members, you mentioned something that was quite important for me is just the proactiveness around running a business.
Yeah, sure.
So, if you think about our parents or our grandparents that own businesses, you open up your shop, you take your stands out. If you were Portuguese, you either had a vegetable place or you had a little corner cafe, and that would be your life. You would live in your community, you would go to your churches, but things are changing. I think that doesn't work anymore. I think we have to be very proactive and get involved. And how frustrated we are working with government, we still need to get involved. And it has to be, like you mentioned, in a way that doesn't, put their nose out of joint. We have to read the room. And that's where our skill sits now as business owners. What's your thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, and there is that opportunity, and also, maybe contrasting us with other countries where so many businesses have to rely on government for everything, and when that fails, they can't handle that. And then also when those governments that are more proactive and more competent, when they want to implement certain policy, they do so, versus where we have, in some elements, more ideologically driven government and bureaucrats, but they don't have the ability to implement. Don't underestimate how much room that leaves for business to sort of take the opportunities and to sort of seize the moment. I know it's difficult, and a business now has to, in many ways, you pay taxes almost 3 or 4 times, because you pay your normal tax, and then you have to pay for water and electricity, private sources thereof, and private security. I'm not saying you should have to be forced to do that, but you don't have the kind of competence that you have in the worst cases in some other places around the world, where they've got ideas of how they want to manage a society and economy, and they've got the kind of competence and the fiscal room to do that, whereas our government doesn't have that.
Chris, I've also got a little bit of a strange question, and I really hope this doesn't come out too dodgy, but why have we not... you drive through some of these small towns and you see these businesses kind of really holding out in these small towns. The roads are bad and everything, but they're there, and they're putting everything they can into keeping these businesses open. Why haven't we all naturally gravitated to one specific area in South Africa? Is it because we live and lie in hope? Is it because we underestimate the opportunities in those small towns that people that are local there understand? Are we just suckers for punishment? Why? We've seen a lot of us immigrate, but we haven't seen a lot of us shift. I know a lot of people are going to say Cape Town, but I think there's almost a push against that. A lot of us don't want to be there for many reasons. Do you see what's happening here in other countries in terms of where we are with this dysfunction and it being remedied? Have you seen it anywhere where you've traveled? Have you heard any case studies there?
So I guess on the second part, you saw sort of just before COVID and during COVID, you did see broadly in many even developed countries and economies, you saw a lot of people flooding into more urban centers and more the sort of cities. I think of a country like Canada, in terms of just then relying on that kind of concentration. But then at the same time, in other places, maybe in Europe, you saw people moving away from the urban centers. So they moved to those smaller towns and those smaller cities and sort of urban locations, because they didn't want to be exposed to the pandemic and also to sort of government bureaucracy kind of thing. So it's a mixed bag in the last 5 to 10 years to sort of contrast and compare with South Africa. I think to maybe the first element of your point and what you've raised here, you're seeing, in terms of what's motivating people, I think you're seeing a whole bunch of considerations. So if you're going to the Western Cape and Cape Town, maybe the biggest motivation is service delivery. If you're choosing then to stay in Gauteng, it's recognition of, most of heavy industry is still in Gauteng, the most populous province, the most economically important province. So you sort of, not that you're going to just sort of eat the risk, but that with a higher risk that comes with living in Gauteng is potentially more upside. Maybe we'll start to see provinces like KwaZulu-Natal, parts of the Eastern Cape, maybe Mpumalanga and Limpopo, from a quality of life point of view, those are very strong provinces, but they haven't yet been matched by the kind of service delivery. So maybe you'll see over the next 5 to 10 years, there'll be a shift towards those. So I think fortunately we have we'll probably have more competition between our provinces and between cities. The best upside of that is that it drives different metros and different provinces to sort of up their game, to convince
kind of
people
different
to
feels.
move there. Yeah.
Yeah, so something like a difference between a Chicago and a Seattle kind of scenario.
Sure.
Yeah. So Chris, what is the most important number in SA?
Thanks for asking that most important question. So I know there's a lot of data. We've said there's lots of headlines every day, but this is just the one number for you as a business, for you as an individual, that we think you should always track, and that is gross fixed capital formation, or real fixed investment. That number represents investment in real assets, in heavy plant equipment, in machinery, in roads and bridges and brick and mortar businesses. Those kinds of investments that tell you that there's more real confidence in a given country, and also in the sort of future prospects of a given country. It's not just buying stocks on the stock exchange, which is relatively easier and you can buy and sell anytime. We see South Africa, the JSE, is one of the best performing emerging market stock exchanges the last year, but that doesn't mean we see it in real growth. So South Africa's target of gross fixed capital formation is 30%, 30, as a percentage of GDP. The only time we got close to that was the 21%, just before the Soccer World Cup. So in 2008, 2009, we got 21%. Otherwise, we average between 16 and 13%. So we should be getting a lot higher. And also, to contrast us with other emerging markets, they can get between 25 and 30%. So that's where we should be playing. Should this rate increase? In the last 2 quarters, we've seen a little bit of movement here. Should your gross fixed capital formation rate increase? It's a very good lead indicator of growth. So if we can see quarter on quarter, year on year, that our gross fixed capital formation is picking up to 20%, 25%, that's going to tell us that there's more real confidence from a domestic and international point of view in the South African economy.
Chris?
Yeah.
When are we going to get there, brother?
If we get there,
pull
again,
out the crystal ball. We want
3 to 5 years. I'm not going to hedge on sooner than that. So I want to see it consistently. Yeah.
So you like consistency for you?
Yes,
you're a numbers person. You want to see consistent numbers.
Trying to, you know.
But what happens if you're someone like Brad, who's got like ADHD and loves chaos?
Well,
Are you predicting the next 3 years to be chaotic?
Oh, absolutely. Globally, yes, 100%. Yeah. And I say that based on how the US is going to become relatively more isolationist, and that's going to open up gaps for good things and bad things to happen. It depends on how other countries deal with this now, especially Europe. I mean, Europe, we've seen how Russia has been testing Europe in the last 2 weeks, different European countries, because they're seeing a gap here in the relationship between the US and the EU. That's going to raise lots of questions going forward. So maybe for you, Brad, I don't know, I think you need to do next month's presentation so you can tell us how we deal with a much more chaotic world.
Yeah, I think it is very difficult. I think some of us love, and I think as South Africans, we're quite traditionalists. So we love, our auntie did this and our grand did this and we're doing this, and this is how things work. I think it is very difficult and it is chaotic at the moment and it's very difficult to predict. So thank you for, giving us an idea of kind of where we're headed. What else do you want to focus on? I think when we talk about government and our expectations for government, for me, it would just be really, really nice if they could just fix my robot outside my place. And just fix that one pothole. I've even given it a name. Her name is Betty.
Oh, nice.
And I greet Betty every day. We have a bit of a relationship, Betty and I. Love-hate. What do you think from your research? What are South Africans looking for in terms of priorities for government? Yeah,
so Brad, you're definitely you're consistent with most South Africans in terms of your priorities. When we poll every year, we do our polling annually. We would like to do it more regularly. It is quite expensive.
Yeah.
I can talk about the methodology and stuff, but in any case, for the last 10 to 15 years, whenever we've done our polling, we see year after year, the top 2 issues that our respondents say should be priorities for government are always unemployment and crime and security. Last year, or earlier this year in our polling, illegal immigration came in second, just above crime and security, but it's still sort of neck and neck. But unemployment, number one, biggest priority. And you contrast that at the bottom of the sort of graph with things like land reform, racism, inequality. This particular finding doesn't say that those aren't issues that people want addressed. But if you force people to say, what are your top two issues? It's these things at the very top that don't necessarily always grab the headlines in terms of political speeches and promises and all that kind of thing. It's more around these more populist elements. So we think political parties who can also credibly lean into these issues and show that they're serious about addressing them, they're going to gain purchase across South African society, because this is also, the polling is conducted across income levels, across racial lines. We see South Africans as generally centrist and conservative. They want stability, they want government to work, they want lower crime, they want good schools for their kids. They want to work together. They don't want to be divided and fight with each other as politicians sometimes want. So we see it consistent with the polling as well.
This is very interesting. Hey? And I just popped a message there that there's no official number on illegal immigrants in South Africa, but we're looking at close to just under 4 million undocumented. That's massive, eh, Chris?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it will, I mean, the questions around immigration, that's going to come more to the fore if we don't again get some of our sort of basic service delivery issues right. Because if you are someone who has never been able to go to school, or you don't get good health care, it is very possible to then lean into arguments around, well, of course not, because there's so many illegal immigrants in the country, versus putting the pressure on government to eliminate waste and corruption, where they should be using those resources that we as taxpayers pay to deliver services.
Yeah, massive. Chris, we got a few minutes left.
Cool.
Key takeaways.
Yeah.
It was a great session in my view, Chris. I hope you had a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you enjoy this. This is your passion, right?
Yeah.
Or do you kind of do other things?
No, I mean, it's reading spreadsheets, right? So you're taking you're taking away time out of my day to crunch the numbers. So I'm very frustrated. No, but thank you. This has been very good.
Cool. Key takeaways.
I might go watch the highlights of the game on the weekend again. So that's next on my priority list. I'm going to skip over some of the first bullet points. We'll share the slides afterwards. So if there are other questions, of course, people can ask those. Just this very last bullet point that I want to highlight to audiences generally. What is the most dangerous phrase in leadership? So for a business, for a government, for you in your household, in our assessment, the most dangerous phrase in leadership is, I didn't see it coming. So my takeaway here is, to you as businesses, to you as citizens of South Africa, given the country's high potential, mitigating the risks, taking knowledge of those, dealing with those, but also sort of putting yourself up to take advantage of the opportunities when they do emerge, to not then be put in the position to where you say, I didn't see this coming, I didn't know about this. Given the positions that you occupy, it comes with that sort of responsibility, but I think it comes with that massive upside potential. And there are fewer better places, I think, from a quality of life point of view, from a challenging oneself point of view, from a sort of dealing with different people and playing to their strengths and mitigating their weaknesses. There are fewer better places in the world to do that than in South Africa, and we all have that opportunity. So I think we need to lean into that, and that'll be the note on which I am. Thank you, Brad.
Thanks so much, hey, Chris. And just to reach out, if somebody would like to bring you into their space, to help with research and planning and strategy, is that something that you do? Do you offer services to the members in SAEFA?
Yes, we do indeed. So on this slide, you can see my email address. I'm listing there just some of the services and products that we offer. I want to say we're available 24/7, maybe not every day 24/7, and not every day of the week, but most of the time. So those are reports, daily, weekly, monthly, research, data, research queries, finding out, what is the demographics of schools in Alberton in South Africa, whatever it might be, we're that sort of that outsourced research division for you and your business. So that's the kind of thing that we do, we lean into, and we greatly value these kinds of relationships, because we can, read a lot, we can talk a lot, we can analyze things, but it's ultimately up to to businesses like those in the room who have to, make things work. So we want to get that relationship and that feedback from various businesses as well.
And Chris, I think it eliminates the thing that we are typical for, and that is assumption. As a lot of business owners, we make a lot of assumptions where you come along and you kind of just nail it down with fact. And I think for any business that's mitigating a lot of risk, having someone on your team that gives you hardcore figures, facts that you can deal with, not Trump facts, facts, real ones, then it really helps your business, hey, Chris?
Yeah, that's very much the idea, right? And also to just maybe think differently sometimes. So to test planning strategies or scenarios or investment strategies to see, is this kind of thing going to hold in the best case scenario or the worst case scenario? It's also part of, I guess, the responsibility as a business owner.
Yeah, and it would be really nice for the members to reach out. They've got your mail address there, and maybe just have a consult with you to see how you can work with them. Research is very important for us as well. It's very difficult when we get brought clients and they haven't done adequate research.
Sure.
And Chris, we're always quite amazed at the big corporates, how they lack actual knowledge, research-based decision making. It's usually done by a charismatic, I don't know how to say that word, CEO or a team within the business. So I think this is amazing, because you do really, really good work, brother. You should be so proud.
No, thank you, Brad. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Gordon, that's us. We're 1 minute over time. Guys, next time we will keep you in the loop of what we're going to be chatting about, but I think it's something to do with BEE or HR, or one of the key issues that we are facing, which I think is going to be really awesome. But Gordon, it was a good session, eh? Chris is awesome, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I wanted to kind of interact a little bit more, but then I thought, the more Chris speaks, the more I like to just absorb, and I think that's true of everybody. So I think you guys did an unbelievable job as always. And my sort of message would be, please, to the members, guys, take what Chris and his team do very, very seriously. I've been privileged enough to spend a lot of time with Chris, and every time I speak to him, the amount of insight and the amount of energy and the amount of thought that goes into what they do is just unreal and unbelievable. So I would echo everything that you've said, Brad, and I think a wonderful session this afternoon. I just wish we had a ton, lots more time just to go into absolutely everything that Chris has to say, but then we'd be busy for weeks, I think.
And apparently Chris has got a game to watch. I don't know why he's putting himself through that again.
I don't know what game he's talking about.
Wow. Well, maybe the Currie Cup final, actually. No, I don't want to watch that one.
Well, guys, thank you very much, Gordon. And yeah.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining us. And Chris, as always, thanks to you and your team for everything that you do for us. And hope to see you again very, very soon.
Thank you, Gordon. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Bye.